And we're back. Welcome to Abstractable. I'm Lockie and this is Ryan. And the Abstractable Podcast is for the curious people with a desire to learn. The goal of this podcast is to bring what might appear unattainable or reserved only for the successful to anyone. In this episode, we talk about The Year Without Pants by Scott Berkun.
And we cover the founder, Matt Mullenweg, how he dropped out from college to running 20% of the world's internet, why culture is and always will be king, common misconceptions that stop organizations from moving to remote working, how a bazaar is a lot more organized than it actually looks, and how to enable remote work at your workplace with some takeaways that we've implemented ourselves. So it's particularly relevant at the moment because we're seeing a world that's moved or been forced to move to a more remote way of working and want to see some of the best ways to do it. You can find out more about the author, Scott Berkun, at his websites with the same name or on Twitter @Berkun. We hope you enjoy the episode. And we're back. How you going, Lockie?
Good. How are you?
I'm well. I'm in my 4th week of containment and I'm doing really well.
Good to hear. Are you allowed out at all? What do you do? Shops and back?
Yeah, we're allowed to go to the grocers, essential services, and we're allowed to go and participate in medical treatments if we need to. And there was actually a ban just 2 days ago on exercising during the day because I believe people in Paris weren't truly respecting the idea of an hour of exercise just by yourself outside.
Okay,
whereas
right.
people were using it as an excuse to kind of go about and do whatever they wanted.
So now everyone's doing some sort of weird night exercise.
Yeah, or still just disregarding it. I'm not sure.
Fair enough. So big announcement. We've started doing some live episodes, the first one of which was last week.
Yeah, and how brilliant that was. I think we had about a 3-second lag between us at the time. We had some internet difficulties, but we managed to get something out there.
It wasn't the smoothest or the best content yet, but we're working on it. So you'll see us go up on Instagram Live every now and again and talk about something topical. So
tune in. So, Lockie, this episode, what are we doing?
So we're talking about essentially a book called The Year Without Pants by Scott Berkun, and it's about remote working, which is super topical. The topic really is Matt Mullenweg, who created Automattic and Wordpress, and Automattic is the company that this is based upon, and their business is fully distributed. So they do not work in an office together and haven't since the inception of the company. So it's pretty cool, and there's a fair bit to learn for what we're all going through at the moment.
Yeah, and let's emphasize how well these guys have done. Like it's not just a random company. This company powers about 20 to 25% of the internet. So
they're doing pretty well
on the World Wide Web.
Yeah. Why should we care about this book, mate? Like, why are we talking about it?
Obviously, very topical at the moment. We're seeing a lot of companies move to more remote ways of working, and I think we're going to actually see a slight shift in the paradigm. I don't think there's certainly limitations to remote working, and we'll discuss a few of those. But this company has been an absolute pioneer in really paving a slightly new way of working, and continues to do so. And it's quite interesting because it's not what you expect from an organisation, and it might make you feel a bit uneasy in terms of how things are approached, particularly if you're in a management or leadership role.
Yeah, it's pretty strange. It's pretty foreign, but we'll talk about all the pros and cons of it as these guys see it, as they've built one of the biggest internet companies in the world. So Matthew Charles Mullenweg, we'll give him a quick bio here because he's not specifically the topic of the book as such, but he is kind of the main person they focus on and probably the key I suppose, focus of Automattic and the book at large. So he was born in January 11th, 1984 in Houston. And he always thought he was going to be a musician, actually. During his high school years, he attended the Performing and Visual Arts high school where he studied jazz saxophone in Texas. He did go to university, to the University of Houston, but he dropped out in 2004 to focus full-time on a piece of software he created called Wordpress. So that started in January 2003 with a fella called Mike Little. Mullenweg started it, and they were soon joined by a fellow contributor, Michelle Valdriga. Oh, that's definitely not how you pronounce it. It sounds a little French, Ryan. Can you help me there?
I don't think there's any French in that.
Okay, well, we'll carry on.
Valdrigi?
Yeah.
That's my attempt.
Let's go with that. But he was 19 years old at the time. And he started this project and was kind of like, a hobby coder. And he started it based upon the open source principle and philosophy. So essentially what that is that open source makes the source code of software available to anyone, and people work on it in a distributed fashion for free. And all the results of it kind of get, updates get put on this software and anyone can use it, basically.
It's like releasing your secret source, mate.
Yeah.
Excuse
and
the pun.
there's some famous that is a shocking joke. There are some famous versions of this, like obviously WordPress is probably one of the biggest ones, but I know Tesla releases a lot of its patents and stuff like that. And there's a lot of other things like Linux. I think Firefox is open source. Can you think of any others, all right?
I know McDonald's don't release their source recipe.
It's just doubling down on it. Very good. He became more obsessed by this program, and it really took off because it was kind of early on in the internet, and it became really popular in the blogging community. And essentially what it is, it's a base that you can build websites on top of. And that's what WordPress is, and it lives at wordpress.org, and anyone can use it. So as this was getting bigger, he was sort of seen as a bit of a hotshot. He was hired by CNET, if you remember that website. Probably still exists, but, it was a bit bigger back then, and to work on blogging and WordPress for them. But he kind of got sick of that as it became more popular, and he quit to work on it full time. He also dropped out of university. And then he created essentially the company Automattic with Matt as the middle of it, as a bit of a joke from him. He's probably got a good sense of humour like you.
That's Automattic with two T's is what you're meaning there.
That's what I mean. Correct. So, and he basically founded that company and started the project WordPress.com, which is built off the source code of WordPress, but then it put additional features on top of it to make a community of blogging and blogging easier. To sort of the general person, non-tech head. And so he started that and used many of the principles from, say, his open source early days to, essentially run the company, which we'll get into a bit later on. And he hired a lot of the people that he worked with during the WordPress.org project. So if you fast forward to today, Automattic has over 1,200 employees, and they almost exclusively work from their own homes or offices or wherever they want to in over 75 countries. And WordPress itself powers 455 million websites, or over 20% of the internet. And Matt's been named one of the most influential people in the world in terms of shaping the internet. And Automattic's now valued at around, on its last fundraising round, at around $3 billion. And it owns things like Tumblr, something called WooCommerce, Gravatar, you probably come across that, as well as many other products. But it's still WordPress.com. It's one of the most visited websites on the internet and is probably still their main product. So that's a pretty cool success story.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. It's one of those classic, college dropout stories, really.
Yeah, that's it.
And changed the entire game. He, one of the big things for the people that don't actually know what WordPress is or haven't seen it, which are like must be fewer and fewer people now, but it really brought like this modular nature of coding to the general user. So you can kind of get in there on their website and start your own website with a few clicks of a button, basically, and start putting content out there. And so it's given rise to companies like Wix and Squarespace and all those others that we hear of today.
Yeah, that's it. So the author, Scott, was born in Queens, and he worked at Microsoft during its early days, particularly on the Internet Explorer builds from version 1 to version 5. So he worked there from 94 to 2003. So really early days in the internet, and Microsoft was still a major force then. And his speciality is
still is today.
It's been an interesting journey for Microsoft, but they're only picking up pace now that they've gone to kind of a SaaS model and just bolt on new products all the time. It's very powerful. But he always wanted to be a writer, so he left in 2003 and started writing books. And essentially he's published about 7 books, mainly around teams and creativity, but this one in particular is when he worked at WordPress between 2010 and 2012. And he did that to kind of say for material for a book, but also to just experience a new way of working. And, he talks a lot to teams and does sort of some consulting. So he wanted to, I suppose, sharpen his skills and also offer some of that to WordPress or Automattic. And so at that time, they had about 50 employees that got up to about 120 by the time he left. And he published this book in 2013.
It's pretty interesting, like the idea of just hiring someone in for a year just to, for their book. Obviously the idea was that it was a bit of a, he was going to provide value in helping Mullenweg establish some teams and things, but it's a pretty interesting concept in itself. Hey, I'm going to come in for a year and then I'm gone. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. He came along at a time where they just put in teams into the company. And he was one of the leaders.
So I think one of the main ways that was enabled to happen was one of the biggest things for me from this book is just how important culture is. And culture is king. It's not a saying for no reason.
It is kind of hard to grab though, right? Like, what is it?
It's the unwritten rules and behaviors and ways people go about doing things that is quite often hard to put on paper. But it really, the more that I read into it, the more that it comes from the top. It really is directed from what the very top of the chain allows to occur. And particularly in the forming days, because as soon as you go from having 1 person to 2 people to 3 people to 4 people, you've already got a culture there. There's already like a basal level of culture. And so every time you want to shift that to something completely different, you're shifting this increasingly growing mass, which increases not only with number of people, but with time.
Yeah, it's kind of like I heard it described as an emergent property of a group of people together. It's kind of something that comes out of the sum of its parts, but is, can really direct how people interact together, right?
And I think the key thing is people and having a shared history.
Interesting. There's a lot of buzzwords around this. There's a lot of talk around culture, right? A lot that is complete bullshit.
Well, once you get a few clicks, mate, on a particular topic, then people will take it to town. And the classic approach is how do we get a culture? How do we get the best culture? And one, I think the simplest answer is that it needs to come from the top. And if the top doesn't want to change, then culture won't change.
That's it. It's so hard. I mean, it's not easy, but I think it's got to do with your actions. It's pretty much as simple as that. But the bigger the company, the harder it is, right? Particularly changing it from what it already is, you know.
Yeah, well, you've got, as I said, you've got this big, massive shared history of people and the way they do things. The bigger that is, the harder it is to move that ball onto a different trajectory. And it just takes a lot of time, which is why it takes years and years and years for these large companies to shift from where they are to where they need to be. As you said earlier, Microsoft, it had a few years, maybe what was it, late 2000s, that seemed to be that, the likes of the G Suite coming out and, Apple bringing its, Office products to market really brought some fierce competition for it. And so they had to completely kind of shift the way they were going about doing things. And this goes for many companies.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's pretty interesting that these guys have been able to build such a strong culture, even though they never see each other.
Yeah, well, I think at the core it comes from their driving philosophy, which is about transparency, meritocracy, and longevity. So I really like so transparency, obviously, there's no hidden information, or there's very little hidden information within the walls. So as an example, anyone could jump into any catch-up that's going on at any time, any meeting that's going on at any time. There's these P2 posts that they refer to, which is basically jobs or projects or things that need to be done, and they're just up on a forum essentially for people to do and work on and try and take on as a team. Meritocracy, which is authority was earned, but sorry, there's no authority earned, and people who are actually doing the work or fix things are the ones that are given the respect.
Yeah, there's they put the creatives or the people that are actually producing the work first, right? And it's interesting because that's quite opposite to a lot of organizations, that you have to really work towards that, because there's a natural phenomenon that kind of happens where the support teams are put in place to support the people who are delivering the outcome that provides, the core value of whatever the business is. But then slowly, as those support teams want to keep busy and look busy, they end up more and more and more taking time off the, say, creatives in this instance. And you end up as the creative person supporting the support teams, that the tail's wagging the dog. And Matt is super, super insistent that doesn't happen within his company.
Yeah, the support role is the management, if you will. Yeah, and they don't have much of it. There's not a great deal of management. There's leads across the teams, and there's not much more than that. And the lead's role is to simply allow the creators to do what they need to do.
Yeah.
And get out of their way. And so quite interesting is when people look at companies like this, they want to emulate what's going on, and they want the outcomes. And so there's a tendency to try and jam things where they don't necessarily fit. As an example, say a consultant coming in and saying, "Hey, we think you guys should do this because this is what these guys over here are doing." But what gets missed is you can't jam a new system or procedure or something into a place where simply the culture doesn't allow it. I had this thought about, you need the alignment to exist between the mission of the organization, the values it holds, the people that are brought in, which then kind of flows into the strategy and the kind of planning, implementation, and then eventually the outcome. So if you kind of jump in at the planning stage and completely overlook the mission, values, people, and strategy, you've missed the mark, and it's not going to mesh in.
And what role do language play in that? Because in my mind, like, you hear the word mission, values, people, strategy. A lot of that, many people now hear that and just go to sleep because they've heard it so many times and they've lost trust in that kind of language. Do you think it's how you communicate the same ideas is part of it?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's they are some very abused words.
Yeah, like if your values are quality, integrity, environment or something, like, you know, it's anybody, you know. Pick one of the ASX 200, you probably find they at least have one of those words in their values, and no one gives a shit. You know?
Yeah.
No one could name them, and it is hard to instill something like that into people, for sure. And you kind of can't force it. I think it does. Like, I kind of agree and disagree with you here, because I feel like what gets accepted by the management drives the culture. So what they encourage versus what they model themselves, etc. But a leader can't just come in and dictate a completely opposite culture to what already exists or the like, because it won't gel. The organism will reject the new entrant, you know?
Yeah, well, this is why a lot of mergers and acquisitions fail, or the majority of mergers and acquisitions fail, because you literally have you have a unknown entity coming in and invading the system, a virus coming in basically, and the antibodies of the rest of the organization just want to attack it and get rid of it. And this is why they don't gel. And this is where you hear about synergies of M&As and, you know, we're going to get all these great synergies by purchasing this company over here. They often don't work. And this is why synergies are quite often bullshit.
Even the word makes me want to throw up.
But I think you've hit on a good point, mate. Is those are the words that are used, right? Because, you know, that's how we identify what we're talking about. And there's no doubt that WordPress has all these things, but they don't go about forcing a name to them and you know, putting them up as the 10 commandments sitting in front of the organization that gets spat out every month, you know, for what we must do and how we must act and do things. It's a little bit more subtle than that. And that really comes from that culture that's driven.
But I think that they, that's probably also a function of their size at the time of writing of this book, because I think that in essence, when you're 50, it's a lot easier to do it organically than when you're 1,000.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the bigger the mass, the harder it is to move. So what about the people then, Lachie? Who do we hire? Or who do they hire?
They hire a bunch of really independent thinkers, you know. A lot of the people they hire are people that have kind of hacked away on WordPress themselves in their own time, or have been self-employed, or have worked in smaller organizations, rather than, say, you're really big, at least at this time. You're probably more corporate people, and they effectively reckon that they hire self-sufficient, passionate people and get out of their way. It's pretty interesting the way that he actually hires people. He doesn't call them and have a face-to-face Zoom or something. He talks to them only through like Slack, because that's the way they'll be working. And then he'll assign them a sample project to do. and then they get a trial essentially. And if you do it well and you communicate well via the written word and the way that they communicate, then you get the job. And that's kind of makes a lot of sense. Like it's kind of hard to replicate probably for many, but I've found this a lot is like, what can you actually tell in an interview? Like to me, when I interview people, it's and this is a thinking fast and slow thing. Don't overrate your ability to tell what people are like. You can tell like what they're like to talk to and whether they're going to be, I think you've got a better shot at kind of figuring out if they're going to be a good fit, but not a foolproof one. I mean, the best thing you could do is get a reference off someone you know. Like if I had the choice to interview someone or hire them sight unseen and have a really good reference from someone I knew and trusted, I'd take the second one every time. Because don't overrate your own ability to judge it. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're telling me like there's no special challenges in the candidate interviewing process of how many ping pong balls fit in a 747 or anything?
Well, one time we wanted to ask, would you rather fight a horse-sized duck? So what was it? It was, would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? And
what's your answer, mate?
Well, I'm asking you, what's your answer?
Duck. Have I got any weapons?
No, hand-to-hand combat or hand-to-bill or something.
Yeah, see, like a horse-sized duck is fucking scary.
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on what height you're measuring the shoulder of. Are you measuring shoulder to shoulder with the duck and the horse? Because that's a really big duck if it's body to body. But if you're measuring head to head, it's actually a bit smaller on the scale, you know?
But mate, have you seen a duck running at you at the lake? Those things are aggressive. And I think if there's 100 of them, you could at least kind of just run through them a little bit.
Well, it's 100 horses. It's 100 duck-sized horses. So it's a
horse isn't going to run at you. They'll just run away.
All right. So your choice. Yeah, I think, look, I would pick the giant duck, but it's really a personal preference, I think.
I want to hear the justification behind the 100 horses as to why someone's more afraid of that.
Well, I don't know. I think it's just there's just so many of them, and they might like surround you and start running around in like a Man from Snowy River style Brumby situation, kicking up dust and. Yeah, they can move.
I wonder what like the rear kick, because like you never walk behind that's the number one rule in the world of horses. Never walk behind the horse.
True.
I wonder what like a full blown kick behind a duck sized horse would feel like.
It wouldn't feel that bad, would it?
Yeah. See, that's their strongest draw card, mate.
But if they
haven't got that going for them, don't worry about it.
If they get you on the ground though.
Yeah, how are they doing that?
Well, they might run at you, sweep you off your feet, and then start kicking you after that. Surround you and just.
They'll need to find like a really well placed kick into like my temples or something. All of them going at the same time to have any impact.
Yeah. Look. All right. Well, to the listener, if you could please comment on Instagram what you would actually prefer, and I'll put up the question.
So back on track. They don't have any of those silly experiments during the interview process.
It's probably good. So I think for me, a really interesting part of this whole book, if you took it up like a higher level, is like the constraint of working remotely. So like they've taken something that everyone thinks is like absolutely necessary and questioned that and gone, well, what if we actually changed that and said the opposite? And they've built a whole business around it. That is quite groundbreaking, and it makes you wonder what other constraints we've put on ourselves that aren't actually necessary, and what would it actually be like if you changed it? Because at the moment, we're all having to kind of run this experiment where we are working from home, most of us, if we're able to, who still is able to work in the knowledge space. We're all kind of running this experiment because we have to. We've been forced to by the government and for our own health. So a lot of us, me included, are finding we're quite enjoying it when we never thought we would. And I think a lot of people I've talked to said, oh, well, I won't go back full time to the office. I'll still work from home if I can because I quite like it. And so the advantage for him is that by removing that constraint, he can hire anyone from anywhere in the world, and he can give them full autonomy to do whatever they want. So they're going to be probably more happier and fulfilled and get a really different perspective. And so I wonder, are org structures necessary? Position titles? What product you're offering? What if you could? I wonder what else you could challenge.
Printing out all your emails so you can read them in front of you.
Yeah, it's kind of like, okay, if you see this a lot where I'm starting to notice this, and I do it a lot too, is you change, say the way a software changes. That's a perfect example of what you just said. Okay, everything's gone electronic. So, but we still print everything out. So we actually, the whole mechanism of that's like kind of a leftover from letters, So we haven't really evolved the mechanism to go with the way the structure's changed or the technology's changed. That's rife, I reckon.
Well, WordPress, right? They have emails, but they're just there just so that everyone can have an email address. They don't get used. And Scott had made an estimation that it probably gets about 1% of the communication use, and all he used it for back in 2011 was to just do a monthly check-in, like an extended check-in to get a full list of information about how his team were feeling, what they were up to, where they want to go, what they want to do, that type of thing. And that was it.
Yeah, that's crazy. So
and also to integrate with all the other organizations that, refuse to use anything else.
Which is the network effect.
Yeah.
So they've still got an office, don't they? Or they did at this time.
They do. And what can you tell me about that office, Lockie?
So no one uses it, right?
Yeah, they've got this well, certainly back then, back when this book was written, it was, we see a lot of them now, these like really fancy offices. I know like Airbnb has one. They've got all these beautiful plants and timber and well-designed architecture all the way through, lots of natural light. But you go into the one at WordPress, there's no one there. And so they're only used to basically to sell things to people that, to big corporates or things that are on a mission to see what this organisation looks and feels like. And so they'll ask people to come in on that particular day, the 8 to 10 people or whatever that live in San Francisco, or they're used for team events, which, again, very rare.
Yeah, so essentially it's super interesting this because it's a signal that they need, because venture capitalists and people they're doing deals with who are more traditional cannot actually process this idea properly. It makes them uncomfortable. Because when they're going to look at this stuff, they're actually just looking for, does it pattern match with the other successful companies I've invested in? And they need these cues to say, well, yes. And so that's really, he said he had a lot more trouble raising money when he didn't have the office. Which has nothing to do with the fundamentals.
It's a PR strategy, but
Yeah, and you actually, I think this plays into but it plays into some mechanism of the discrimination, say, in terms of who gets funded or what have you between men and women, and also with age and things like that. Like, I think that it may have gotten a bit better, but there's certainly a lot of things where it's like, oh, if you're a 22-year-old male who wears a T-shirt who dropped out of Stanford, you're ticking all the boxes to be like, all right, you're a bit like Mark Zuckerberg, But if you don't fit that mold, all of a sudden the pattern recognition's off, and it's a subconscious thing mostly, I'm sure. And you don't have a good a chance. You're getting kind of a bias against you.
Yeah, it's a paradigm. So you want to fit in the paradigm. And I was thinking about this. It's like, is this something because it's where the corporate identity currently sits? That we have an office, that we have a place that we sit, versus we're all working wherever we want to work. Particularly in the tech business. Or is it ingrained in human nature? Like, is it a tribal thing? Do we need to have a shelter? Do we need to have a place where we can congregate and come together? And so it's more than just a paradigm of the corporate structure that's been built. It's, like, I was trying to think, can we replicate this in a digital way? Like, imagine grabbing a screenshot of a Zoom meeting with 30 of your people in there, like, versus showing off a nice showy office or something. They're obviously not comparable. But I wonder if there is a digital way to kind of do the same thing or tell the same story.
That's interesting. I don't know. I guess you can have status shown in different ways. Maybe it's like how many visitors you have to your website or something like that. I don't know. I definitely feel like space is something that's in most cultures, even property ownership or having things seems to be part of being human. Maybe not so much for the hunter-gatherers, but there's still physical objects that hold value and signal to other people. So it's definitely part of human nature, but I think the status signals can be non-physical too. I think that's why a big reason why social media works. You can do a lot of status signaling with bits.
So do you think we might be able to one day, instead of showing off an office or using an office as, what we're going to put up on our website, this nice covering image with all these green plants and architecture, and instead we might post a screenshot of our internal wiki or something like that. This is what we're like. This is our culture. Or a couple, like a video feed or a news feed inside the company of what's going on. This is the vibe.
Possibly. Yeah, I can't see why not. Maybe, I don't know if it's going to be as effective, but I think it's definitely possible for sure. What do you think?
I think there's something more than just the paradigm is at the crux of it. We want to see people. We want to know, get an understanding and a feel for the identity of the people that are there. And so I think it's going to be something really difficult until we're all living in like Second Life, and we can put the VR goggles on and immerse ourselves in the Matrix. I think that's the only alternative.
Hey, quick question. Do you think you'll ever go to the moon?
Depends if Elon has his way, mate.
But seriously, in your lifetime, do you think you'll go out of orbit, let's say that, or into orbit?
I think it will be possible in my lifetime. I don't think that's too far-fetched of a statement. But I think it will still be fucking expensive if you want to catch a Virgin flight from Australia to New York. I think you're going to have a lot of money to be able to do that.
Oh yeah.
What about you?
It's going to be very expensive. I think it will happen, but I don't know. I might be getting sucked into the Jetsons trap here, where you kind of think that.
Tell me about the Jetsons trap.
I don't know. It's something I made up where I think that we accelerate what we think is going to change. So like you watch the Jetsons and they were all in space flying around in these fancy things, and I don't actually know what time frame that was, but like let's say you watch 2001 A Space Odyssey, or all these things where they thought we'd be a lot further advanced than we are in, say, the physical world perhaps, or just I think they think that the fundamental things, there's a misconception that a lot of the fundamental things will change when a lot of them stay the same. So I don't think we'll accelerate as fast as perhaps what a few people are thinking. But I kind of feel like we will. I feel like we'll be able, if we had enough money, it won't be ridiculously out of reach. It might be like as expensive as a flight to Europe was for our grandparents or something, because that was really expensive back in the day. But I think that might be a case where I'm like up in orbit, like this is incredible. And like my grandchildren are sort of like, oh, lame granddad. Who cares? We're just, like, oh, it's cool, but whatever. And I'm like, this is a modern marvel. We do that every day
on Second Life. What are you doing that for?
That's it. Why do we need to
do the real thing?
Yeah. Anyway, that was a very good detour. I wanted to talk about with this book.
You really shot us off into orbit there, mate.
Oh, it hurts that. It hurts. All right. So bottom up versus top down. So
I think no, I was going to say, right. I think it's a really interesting idea. So, I have been listening to a little bit of the Portal podcast, and Eric Weinstein, who's the host of that show, he has some pretty interesting perspectives. But basically, he thinks that scientifically, the world hasn't progressed since the 70s. And there's some pretty bold statements. I can't really explain them, but he thinks that we're on a lost tangent following string theory as an example. And there was an explosion of a disconnection between, GDP per person and I think it was technological progress or something. There's these two markers, right? And there was this big divergence that happened in, around that time, maybe the 80s and just after all this had happened. And we basically haven't seen the same acceleration that's occurred as a result of the physics, the physics revolution that occurred within technology. So, for example, quantum theory and things has had a massive influence on a computer, for example. The only reason we have computers is because of that. And so there's all these other theories and things that have come from, these more hard scientific worlds that have played such a big impact. And supposedly we haven't seen a similar, revolution like what happened back then, which is crazy to think. And so it gives rise to the question, are we going to ever have another one? Or are we at the cusp of another one? And if we're at the cusp of another one and the next one's just around the corner, assuming we all get over coronavirus, then and the next thing that comes after that, then maybe it will be, it will be like catching an Uber.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's way over my head, but my gut feel is that things are lumpy. They don't happen in a linear fashion. So I think we've still got new things to discover, and we will discover these things.
Hey, we've got better screens than they had in Back to the Future. So we're doing well there.
True. So, I mean, that's kind of talking about some sort of complexity theory, and Matt Mullenweg's a big proponent of got to get the mention in. There could be a drinking game with this podcast where if we mention Nassim Taleb, you've got a drink. So he. So that's one to you. It's like WordPress's the team's rule that Scott was part of. Their rule on ouzo. If you said
that
ouzo,
rule, every time someone mentioned ouzo, someone had to do a shot of ouzo.
Yeah. Because, I mean, we've done well. We've waited 45 minutes to bring him up. But, Matt really is a big fan of his work and believes in that sort of chaotic, bottom-up approach to creativity and systems, I suppose. So he, his whole business is really, they don't give people many instructions. They let them figure it out. And whoever figures out the best thing, everyone adopts that, and it spreads throughout the company. And this is the kind of thing you can use whatever software you want. You can use Slack, you can use Teams, you can use this, you can use that. And it actually bubbles up. And when he put these leadership teams in place, he didn't give them much instruction. He just said, here's your goals. And they measure output very, very stringently by the sounds of it. So they measure what people produce, and they don't give two shits about whether they actually are working during the day, night, 2, 4 hours, 6 hours. It's what are you producing, and they measure that, or it becomes obvious because of the transparency within the business. So,
but is that across the whole business, mate? Because that's certainly in the space of tickets and the support, the customer happiness team. But are they really measuring like hard metrics across everything else? Because I got the impression that it was the opposite of that.
I think they measure not sort of KPI style metrics, but they measure how much work is actually getting produced, So
yeah, but it's not lines of code.
No. It's like hard output, like, have we shipped this feature and has it helped the business succeed? How you get there is completely up to you and your team,
Yeah, and each team is kind of their own little node. They're off doing their own little thing, and they have their own little ways about doing it. And as you said, they are drawing on this data. So we might have a little project that we want to determine how much this has positively impacted on a customer. So we're going to pull out some data that might represent that. But we know that is just a bit of data. And at the end of the day, we need to couple that with some intuition about how we feel about it, how we thought we went on it, and kind of bring that in. So I think they bring up this really interesting point, which is they are informed by data, but not run by data.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, what you measure becomes a motivator was a quote from the book, and that was quite cool because you've got to be careful with what incentives you're driving. This is the problem with measuring everything. It's super tricky. There's a lot of unintended consequences from putting metrics in place. They are probably a net positive generally, but I think the way that he runs a super flat structure and lets people kind of do the work that they want to better the overall organism of WordPress.com and his other functions, creates a lot of cool new ideas, and it's a part of the success. But it also has some negative consequences that I thought was interesting that I heard throughout and that I could relate to, because we at FSC run a pretty low phi org structure, very flat, kind of have this kind of slightly chaotic setup. And I think that there's a certain messiness to it that you kind of get. You have to kind of be willing to put up with a lack of efficiency in many areas to then get a bigger payoff. But that can actually be quite bad because things start to look a bit. You do need some top down to kind of put some sort of smoothness in place, say with user interface and things like that in their instance, is that everyone's adding these features, but no one's looking at how they kind of properly coordinate together. And because of that, on the edges, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit left on the tree, like around how people should actually subscribe to the website, how they getting to the features was kind of clunky. There were lots of them. It wasn't that clear in terms of for the user experience. And only a person looking at all the parts from the top could really figure that out and smooth that out. And I kind of it made me think of like a tree, you know. A tree doesn't look like a car, you know, it's kind of that organic has that kind of roughness to it. And I think that you get those same sort of consequences when you build something bottom up. It's not pretty a lot of the time. And so that's where you could see them in this book starting to put that kind of nice little bit of top level in that could actually, a bit like a government would kind of regulate things. He's kind of taking that same approach to his organisation. He's letting all the shops and stuff open in the city, but he's putting the streets in and he's making some top-down rules about when you can operate and this sort of stuff and letting the rest happen.
Yeah, so this is what you're talking about with the bazaar and the cathedral, which is they are running the bazaar, just to be really clear. So, you know, the chaotic nature of a bazaar, and
a bazaar being kind of like a market, Middle Eastern market, right?
Yeah, not the bazaar, although it's arguably both, depending on which one you're at. So that bazaar nature is this organic growth of, you know, different shops setting up in similar locations. They're going about doing different ways of selling things or presenting things there, and it kind of develops this really great value for people to come through and have a wander, you know, and attracts people because it's so diverse and so different and creates this really great overall value. Versus the cathedral, which is, you know, you've got an architect's vision for what the cathedral is going to look like, and they've got, you know, arguably everything mapped out, although they often forget the buildability of the thing. Just talking from construction point of view. And so coming into that, they can see what the outcome is going to be and where they're going to go, as opposed to the tree that kind of follows the light, you know, the sunlight, and you'll see plants kind of shift off in one particular direction, governed by the sun. It's a very similar thing, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just a really, really interesting idea. I think the other thing that I found interesting was that the transparency sometimes meant that the whole company was in one chat room, or so everyone can see everything, but that actually makes it hard. And I've noticed this as our business has grown. It makes it hard for people who are perhaps a bit more reserved to share like they would when they're in a smaller group. So in some ways, the transparency can quash people taking big risks because it's so open. You're so exposed. And that's something to be balanced, I think.
Do you think that's an issue with transparency? Or do you think that's an issue with a culture that doesn't allow people to fail?
I think it's transparency because I think people are more, it feels like a bigger risk because there is no utopia where everyone thinks, oh, if I didn't fail, failure doesn't matter. It's celebrated, yeah, to a point, but even in these big companies, you're supposed to do well. That's again, I feel, part of human nature. So I think that that there is a slight, there's positives and negatives to anything. So to me, it's that if everyone can see what everyone's doing, people aren't as willing to be honest or as willing to take big risks without someone backing them. So maybe there's just a bit more organizational structure that's needed there, I think.
Yeah. So so I think in less transparent organizations, there's far less risk that's taken, to be honest. So
yeah, I think I do agree with that. I just think that it's probably a net positive, the transparency, but I think there are things about it that it isn't the golden bullet or the silver bullet or whatever.
Do you think it's what it is coupled with? So if transparency becomes an excuse for people just to say whatever they want to say, it potentially gives extra voice to the people that have the loudest voice, the squeaky wheel in this instance. And so the people that are more prone to be reserved in their opinion or, belittle their own ideas, again, are less hesitant to speak up. I also think that that's part in role of the leader, the team lead's role to encourage equal speaking time,
Correct. I think
allow
that's
everyone
where
to speak what they want.
Yeah, that's where if you create small teams, you can get around it, I think. But there's a super interesting point here on innovation in general that it was in the book. It said the fundamental mistake that companies do with innovation is they keep the barriers to entry very high. They make it hard to try out ideas and are blind to how much experimentation you need to sort the good ideas from the bad. They believe that you can tell a good idea as soon as you hear it, and that you need to go through all these approval processes to weed out the bad ideas, so that you can just try the one good one and get on with building it. It doesn't work like that.
I love the business case, mate. I love the corporate business case that you spend more time putting together the business case than you would putting the actual project together or giving it a test or trying it out. And so by people just don't even bother. And then we've seen this like big wave of, the innovation trend of late where people are now running, design thinking workshops and all this kind of stuff. Again, it's that we're trying to fit the ping pong ball through the triangle. It just doesn't work, mate. You can't just kind of make things fit. It needs to be organic. It needs to be given directive from the top. It needs to be embedded that people are allowed to try things and fail, and some will fail.
It takes a lot of practice. Like I've tried new ideas quite a lot in the last years, and I'm not that good at it yet. It's taken me a long time to figure out how to do things quickly and do them well and do them right. I've still got a long way to go to try and figure all that out. So you've got to be able to try it a lot.
I don't think we ever. I don't unless you're operating maybe the same. But even then, it's the same domain. But even then, I still don't think we actually get that good at doing ideas because we all get sucked into our own biases and cones of silence, like what we discussed in episode 4, in Thinking Fast and Slow. It's just we can't but help it.
It's so hard to do. The biggest thing I've found, it's a lot harder to get your ideas done and find out if they're any good quickly than it seems. It takes a long time to get them up and going and to try them out and to really figure out if they're working or not. It sounds simple, but it just isn't.
Yeah, you can't slap an innovation poster up on the wall, mate.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're running a little short on time, but there's one quote I just wanted to mention before we get onto some remote working stuff, that the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. It was a quote in the book that's attributed to someone called William Gibson. That was my favorite quote of the whole book.
Yeah, that was great.
And yeah, it's like someone's doing right now that you could probably find the way of working that we'll all be doing in 20 years. You just got to find them and try and figure out if it's a signal or just noise. And it's a real sums up why you need to kind of go cross domain in your thinking, which we talked about in episode 7, which may or may not already be out by the time we release this one. But is that, yeah, you really want to try and steal from others as much as you can.
Yeah, but it's also, as you said, it's not evenly distributed. So at the same time as having, let's say, WordPresses, let's just hold them as the beacon of innovation and, progressive thinking in terms of running a company. We've also at the other end of the scale still got, child slave labor picking cocoa beans in South America somewhere. Like, there's the full spectrum of things from most progressive and digitalized or future thinking all the way to practices that were being done for thousands of years, really.
Yeah. It's not an idea that you think about too much, but it really struck me. So,
yeah, me too. So what about a little bit more pragmatism, Lockie? We've spoken a lot about culture and some real big generalities. What about where we are now? And I think we were speaking about whether we might do a mini series on remote working and just our own experiences in doing it, and maybe helping others transition themselves. But what were some takeaways that you took?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's just give a little teaser here, and we'll record some separate thoughts on it.
You leave the hook there for them.
Damn right.
Good on you.
That's it. That's marketing, baby. So, I mean, there's so much in this, but there's kind of probably strategies and tools or tactics that you can use, like mentally. I mean, a big one for me is making sure you have a designated place to do your work. That's a huge thing for me. And space is something that has a big effect on me personally, I've realized over the last few years. So that's big. But something you touched on was that, in terms of tools, they're never really the thing that's primarily important.
Yeah. Now this is at WordPress, right? But I think we'll notice that there's a lot of companies that are making a transition at the moment, and they're going from already being in the motions, already being in the flow, and by allowing everyone to kind of go off chaotically and start trying their own things, I think this is one of these instances that's not going to work well. And so I think there might be a few things that could be established. So communication, I think, is a big one. And particularly for already mature organizations that have been operating in a more traditional sense, moving to like a remote distributed way of operating, particularly during what we're going through, if just maybe mandating a core platform for communications is probably a critical one. So are we going to use the Microsoft suite with Teams and Planner and things to kind of discuss how we're going about doing things, or are we going to use Slack, and integrate that with some other platforms, or are we going to use simply Skype? I think a really good feature to have is status, like the actual status of where people are, and they actually discuss this in the book. And whilst it doesn't illuminate a great deal, you can certainly find out when people are online, when people are just want to not be bothered.
I think another one is on the similar track to that communication piece is the way you communicate is important. Text can come across as quite terse. And so something that they encourage at Automattic is that you should try and fluff the language up a bit to compensate for that. And that if things are feeling a bit weird on your messages, get into a Skype call or a phone call and just diffuse it, because there's a lot of times where it can be misrepresented. They also say that it's good to summarize threads at the end of them if you're doing a lot of Slack talking and things like that, with just some wrap ups to certain things and conclusions.
Yeah, it's a big skill actually, that one, being able to summarize all the key points honestly and transparently and lay them out.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, it's something that you and I are trying to work on too. It's hard going from being able to talk on the phone all the time to just messages as one of us is in different time zones, and how those come across, I think is it's a good learning curve, right?
We need to pick up the phone more, mate.
That's it. So
some other things we did speak about earlier was like some of the fallacies. So I'm just going to read through a couple here because we want to wrap up. Is, printing. Do we need to print things at all? Do we need to print forms to be signed? Like, why is that an assumption? Meetings needed to actually get work done. So yeah. I think there's a big issue that organizations have with meetings altogether. People just call a meeting because they want to actually talk to someone. Well, there's better ways of doing that. And a big advantage of asynchronous communication, which is people, talking over a Slack thread or something, is that those meetings don't need to occur at all. Needing to answer things urgently, quite often things that are urgent aren't important in the first place. And if they genuinely are important, then how have we got here? There'll still be urgent things. Being face-to-face is the only way to be productive, and, output-based versus time-based. So, it's not about clocking in the, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, however many hours a day. It's about what is actually done. And there's a definite big drop-off that happens after putting in too many hours. That is certain.
100%. So what will you do differently, mate, after reading this book? It's a big book in terms of a lot of new ideas.
I am too much of an architect. I look at the cathedral. I like to look at the cathedral too much, and know all the nooks and crannies and how the ultimate vision is going to look. And I think that can be too constraining in how it translates through into micromanaging to a degree and wanting things done the right way. So letting a little bit more chaos reign in my life. I like it. Encourage a bazaar to grow.
I like that. That's nice. For me,
and you?
I think I'm going to do a little bit more cathedral. I'm a bit too bazaar style. I think I need some of the negatives of the bazaar, although there's so many positives, and I believe it's the best way to be particularly in a small organization that's trying to be nimble. I think I need to address some of the downfalls of that that they talk about in this book in a way that they did. I also think I'm going to do more remote working because I like it. That's pretty obvious.
Love
it. So anything to close, Matt?
No, this is a really good book. I really enjoyed it.
It's a perspective shifter, I think.
Yeah, and very time relevant.
I think that it's just the other thing before we go that I would do differently is I'm going to put some more constraints in place on things that I find are fundamental and see what happens. Not sure what they are yet, but I'm going to try and figure out all the assumptions I've made about what I do and see which ones I could just change and what would happen if I changed them.
Yeah, I think a nice little way to finish off is Scott talks about the advice paradox, which is you can have all the best advice in the world, but at some point in time, you're going to have to make a decision on which advice you follow. And so that is the advice paradox. You still need to make the decision and follow one.
Keep moving.
Keep moving.
Right.
So
See you, mate.
This has been great, mate. Hey, and just to close out for us, we really appreciate if anyone who can and is enjoying what we're doing to subscribe. It's remarkable how much it actually just helps out us on the various platforms and things. So if you have been enjoying, let us know and do subscribe.
And tell a friend. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. We really appreciate it. See ya.
Cheers. See ya.